Tom Ford and Prada, two of the biggest shows on the Milan Fashion Week calendar for Autumn Winter 24. I want to talk about these two shows in tandem with one another because they were both exploring ideas of brand history and of specifically both kind of designers offered these ideas explicitly of beauty, but the results of these explorations of history and of beauty came out to stark kind of different contrasts and degrees of success. So I think it's quite interesting to talk about these two shows within the same context, not only because they were also on the same day. So let's start by talking about Prada. Prada, specifically in their show notes, Miuccia Prada and co-creative director Raf Simons talked about this idea of notions of beauty. I mean, beauty always kind of comes up in the notes for Prada in what Miuccia and Raf kind of talk about backstage. I think beauty is always something that comes up when we're thinking about Prada. Definitely when I talk about Prada, it comes up, that idea of beauty, because it's all about kind of making you question, I think, ideas of taste level. It's something that I kind of, if you've seen my reviews before, you'll probably be bored to death of me talking about the idea of taste at Prada and banality, things like that, but it's just so inherent to what Prada does best. So unsurprising to think about Prada kind of thinking about beauty this season, but the lens through how they did that was kind of through Prada's own histories, as well as kind of histories of kind of dress, the kind of history of dress itself. A quote that Raf Simons put in the press release said, "One of the challenges was thinking about taking fragments from history and fragments from the past, which could be Victorian, 1920s, 1950s, but not to create a historical silhouette. This is not about a narrative history. At its heart, this collection really expresses a love for fashion, our love for fashion." And I think that hits the nail on the head about what Prada did so successfully this season, always kind of does really well when it's at its best, but also kind of what a great kind of design duo or designer can do, which is, it's not so much about clothes, but it's how you wear them. That was something really interesting that Karl Marx from Puppets and Puppets told our fashion critic MC Hill in a recent interview. She said, I'm not interested in the clothes you're wearing, it's how you're wearing them. And I think that's so intrinsic to what we saw at Prada this season. There were lots of kind of ties back to kind of Prada's own history, particularly, from the very simple kind of signature we often get with the Prada show, where they walk kind of with their hands kind of clutching the front of their clothes, but that kind of Prada clutch, if you will, but kind of the streamlined silhouette to this, the kind of the pencil skirts with the cropped kind of jackets, those kind of shift dresses as well. Later in the collection, those kind of shift skirts with cardigans reminded me slightly of Spring Summer 2000. That kind of stiffness of a uniform, but then kind of this subversive idea of kind of femininity. It really just encapsulated, I think, a lot of kind of, the silhouettes felt recognizable, they felt Prada, but they always feel kind of refreshed and reinvigorated, because what Miuccia Prada has always intrinsically done is treated fashion as a language. And I think that goes back to what I was saying about clothes. It's what's interesting about style is how you wear those clothes, not necessarily what the clothes are themselves. What meaning do you imbue in those clothes? That was something that Raf and Miuccia were definitely thinking about a lot this season, is what's the context of our clothing? What does that say? You can have a kind of skirt with a kind of Victorian era-esque underskirt peeking out from underneath it, but what does that mean now? You can have that Victorian underskirt kind of reference, but then you have that mixed with kind of this kind of drab, almost carpet velvet embroidery on sheer skirts. It's all about that interplay of different languages of clothing mixing together at Prada. And what does that then say as a final composition, or what can that item then be taken out when it's taken out of context and recontextualized into a woman's life? What does that then mean? What did that, Victorian reference, for instance, say about that time? But then, it's so interesting, that idea of, I'm going to stick on that Victorian underskirt, if you think about the context of that being worn in the Victorian times, and then you're putting it in a Prada show, you know, much more slimmed down. The silhouette's changed, but it kind of has that, that's what brought to mind when I saw it kind of swinging out from underneath the kind of, the Prada skirt, was kind of, then what does that mean for this woman in 2024? And I love that mixing of kind of playing with contexts and histories. You know, coats in this collection and jackets, the back of them were done like the silk backs of waistcoats, and they had the kind of buckle cinches. And it's so interesting to suddenly have that interplay with something else where you kind of don't expect it. The hats in this collection were brilliant. They were kind of military-esque hats, but then have this kind of fetish-like coverings of feathers in kind of bright oranges, purples, blues, that kind of, those, you know, Prada's so much always about texture. It really invigorates your senses when you're looking at it, both in terms of colour, but texture, and how that can, you know, fabrics themselves have kind of such connotations to kind of class and society in terms of how rich those fabrics are, where they come from, how democratic those fabrics are, and you'll always get the interplay of all kind of levels of that. To, you know, you'll have something, a really pragmatic material like a kind of a wool, but then you'll have that mixed with kind of, you know, these dyed feathers or these embellishments. You know, thinking about embellishments and hyper feminine details, that was also something really key to this collection, kind of the opening look, all of these bows, you know, at a glance, maybe that could have been kind of these kind of couture-esque ruffles or something, but you've got these kind of cliche feminine tropes, quote unquote, from the press release, and then recontextualizing that, redefining that within the collection. Again, it comes back to everything I've just been talking about changing that interplay of what a garment means in a different context, and really treating clothing like a language of fashion. And that is how at Prada you look at different forms of beauty. You think about the history of Prada, where it's going. It felt completely relevant to now. It felt really exciting. It felt like a kind of history book Prada collection that just felt, you look at it, you feel inspired by it, you want to wear it. It was just brilliant. And I think it's interesting then in that context to think about how a brand, Prada, can look at its own history and histories of dress and the very language of fashion and present it in this way. And then in the evening, I went to Peter Hawkings' second collection for Tom Ford. Peter Hawkings was Tom Ford's kind of right-hand man for kind of a decade or more. And he knows the brand back to front. When he got the gig after Tom decided to leave his brand, you know, Tom was the one who put him forward for it. It was all very amicable. You know, in interviews that Peter did before his debut, he was kind of saying, you know, I don't want to, this isn't, you know, him taking the role of creative director, and he's not going to wipe the slate clean and redo what Tom Ford is. He very much wants to build and continue what the Tom Ford brand is. That brand is a very strong brand, you know. It's, you know, you think of when Tom was at Gucci in the 90s and those kind of that sex and sexiness that he brought with him there, and how that kind of, that then when he left Gucci and did the Tom Ford brand, that was very much predicated on that idea of sexiness, that idea of sexiness in the 90s and 2000s we so associate with Tom. And he continued to kind of make this into this global kind of hugely expensive brand that's built on this idea of sex and glamour. And, you know, they've got makeup, they've got perfume, you know, it's a popular and well-known brand. It's not an insider. It's not an insider's brand. It's very much a kind of a brand for the glamorous kind of shopper, woman, man. I think what I'm trying to get at is it's infiltrated the masses. And wisely, Pete Hawkings isn't about to kind of go and try and change the whole aesthetic and image of this brand, because it's something that's working, and it's also something which he greatly respects. You know, he is a friend of Tom's, he respects the work that he did, and he also worked alongside him. So it's kind of a big bulk of Peter's career has been working at Tom Ford. So that's kind of also what he knows. The Tom Ford aesthetic is kind of part of his blood as a designer. Unfortunately, I think what we're seeing is it's a reiteration of everything Tom Ford kind of, for instance, this collection, the palette is kind of these pure bright whites, navies, blacks, golds, inflections of kind of purple in here. It's kind of a similar kind of very kind of after dark, after hours kind of colour palette. It's kind of, you know, boot cut, kind of slightly kick flare trousers, like python belts, it's sheer blouses worn open, it's tailoring, you know, lots of tailoring, great jackets and jeans, it's coats, but it feels like an imitation of Tom Ford staples, and it feels like it misses the slight oomph. So for instance, those kind of opening military jackets in this collection just felt somewhat dated. I've got them in front of me, I'm just having a look at them now. It just feels like it's, in contrast to Prada, where we're talking about updating the past and using it as a language of fashion to kind of relate to now, these just feel like items from kind of the past. I don't know if it's kind of the streamlined silhouette, the kind of, I think when we think of modern kind of coat silhouettes right now, it feels much bigger, much boxier. This is very streamlined. It feels very kind of noughties, kind of 2000s kind of sexy. The way that the look too, where that coat is hitting kind of just above mid-thigh, it just doesn't feel cool or fashionable now. We move into this kind of cream, camel, kind of white section. It just feels again like this kind of forced idea of coolness, of glamour. There are definitely pieces in here still that will kind of, you know, that are nice, that speak well, but it just speaks this kind of removed idea of glamour, I think, especially in the women's wear. It doesn't feel necessarily like these models are wearing the clothes. It feels like the clothes are slightly wearing them. It feels kind of like a dowdy nostalgia, not necessarily an electrifying, exciting, revigorated idea of what the Tom Ford brand is. You know, we had kind of Amber Valletta sitting on the front row. Obviously, she was in all those iconic kind of Tom Ford Gucci ads, and it just kind of made me think electrified idea of the past hasn't really been reinstated here. And, you know, the press notes were talking about this idea of a woman who is so powerful that she can be as dressed or undressed as she wants, and that just felt quite removed to me. It felt very much like a removed idea of what a man perhaps thinks a glamorous woman is or should be, or an idea of kind of a glamorous woman, of kind of, you know, when you're watching early seasons of Sex and the City or anything early 2000s, it felt like that idea of a projected idea of a glamorous woman who actually behind it all isn't very happy with herself and feels in competition to all these other women. You know, while as Prada, it's like the power is so in yourself. It's about how the clothes make you feel. It's about this language of dressing. It's so, there's an intelligence to it, I think, which we're missing in the Tom Ford kind of collections that we've seen last season and sadly this season too. And it feels like it's slightly stuck in the past, but with a warped vision of what the past is, and without a clear kind of vision of what this actually means and should say for women today, unfortunately. So yeah, go and have a look at the collections on showstudio.com if you haven't yet, and let us know what you thought in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.